The bells of Natchez tolled midnight as if the whole city were counting down to a soul's last breath. Out behind the courthouse, where the packed dirt turned to mud after every rain, a rough wooden scaffold hunched against the sky. On Joshua stood Voi haite troi quat sao lung, ko ja quang san vong, thong long tho rap, moin huagai va mo hoi. His bare feet were bleeding from the walk through broken shells and gravel, but his back was unmarked. They had offered to whip him into confession. He had refused to kneel, refused to cry, refused to beg. He would not give them that. A crowd had gathered despite the late hour, men in crumpled shirts reeking of whiskey, ladies whose pearls shone pale in the torchlight, fans pressed to lips as if virtue could be held in place. Overseers from nearby plantations leaned on their canes, trading quiet bets on how long the boy would kick before the rope snapped his neck. "He lay with a white woman," someone hissed, "with his own mistress." "He forgot he was property," another spat. "Tonight he remembers." Rain threatened in the air, heavy and metallic. Lightning flickered far out over the river, sketching the silhouette of the scaffold in harsh white lines. Joshua lifted his chin and looked past the faces, past the torches, up into that restless sky. Even now, when death breathed hot at his nape, his eyes held no plea, only a fierce, exhausted defiance. Then the murmuring parted like a curtain. She was walking toward the scaffold. Victoria Elizabeth Montgomery, wrapped in a black mourning cloak despite the heat, boots sinking into the mud. The veil over her face trembled with each breath, but her spine was straight, her stride unbroken. In her right hand, half hidden in the folds of her cloak, gleamed the polished steel of a pistol that had once belonged to her late husband. The sheriff barked her name, shocked. "Mrs. Montgomery, this is no place for a lady." "On the contrary," she replied, voice steady as a blade. "You're about to hang my husband. I will not stay at home while you do it." Gasps knifed through the crowd. Husband. The word fell like a stone into still water, ripples of outrage spreading outward. Joshua's heart lurched, not from fear, but from something so raw it almost hurt more than the rope at his throat. She had said it out loud. Here, in front of them all. "Ma'am," the sheriff warned, hand twitching near his own gun. "The law says he is your slave, nothing more. You confess to this madness. You damn yourself along with him." Victoria took another step forward, the torches painting her veil in flickers of orange. "Then let the law be damned," she said softly. "I will not let you kill him as if he were a beast in the field. If he dies tonight, the world will know exactly who he was to me." For a breathless moment, nobody moved. Thunder rolled low over the Mississippi, as if the river itself were listening. On the scaffold, Joshua closed his eyes. He had promised himself they would not see him break. But now, with her standing there, a lone silhouette against a sea of hate, he felt the first sting of tears. How did a woman born to own human beings come to claim one as her husband in front of the noose? How did a slave who refused to bow become the man she was willing to burn for? Before we go deeper into this merciless verdict of conscience, I want to know who is walking beside me tonight. From which city or country are you listening to the story? Leave a comment below and let me know. Dawn in Mississippi was not gentle. It never unfolded like a blessing. It arrived like a verdict. In the autumn of 1854, the light that crept over the vast Montgomery plantation carried the weight of humidity, the smell of cotton sap, and the lingering ache of songs sung in the dark by people who owned nothing but their breath. The plantation stretched nearly 2,000 acres, rolling fields of white cotton that shimmered in the early sun, framed by lines of ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss like sagging gray beards. The soil was rich, the air was thick, and everything about the land whispered of labor extracted under fear. Before the heat fully settled, enslaved men and women were already bending their backs in the fields, shadows stretching long behind them. Overseer Whitlock rode along the dirt paths with the lazy menace of a man who enjoyed the silence that fell when he passed. His boots were always polished. His whip was always oiled. He liked to remind them both were for keeping order. But in the quarters, where smoke from morning fires drifted through cracked windows and children clung to their mothers' skirts, one name carried differently when spoken. Joshua. He was not the largest man among the enslaved, though he stood near 6 feet tall and carried a body shaped by years of lifting, hauling, chopping. What set him apart was not muscle, it was presence. Most men avoided meeting the eyes of overseers. Most learned early that survival meant looking down. But Joshua, 23 and newly bought from a bankrupt plantation upriver, carried himself with a calm that made people whisper. He moved with a quiet dignity that no chain had managed to break. And though he rarely spoke unless spoken to, when he did, his voice was steady, low, and thoughtful, unexpected in a world that despised both thought and steadiness in a slave. His eyes were the part people remembered, deep brown, nearly black, but alive in a way that unsettled those who wished him obedient. There was no resignation in them, no dull glaze of someone who had surrendered to his fate. Instead, there was clarity, the awareness of a man who saw injustice for what it was, who felt humiliation but refused to let it define him. Some said he had been taught to read, others said he had taught himself. Books were forbidden to him, but he listened when the plantation children recited lessons from their tutors on the veranda. He memorized the shape of letters traced in spilled sugar. Knowledge was dangerous for a slave, but Joshua did not fear danger the way others did, or if he did, he hid it well. Still, the most remarkable part of Joshua's arrival was not Joshua. It was the mistress who bought him. Victoria Elizabeth Montgomery, widow for 3 years, ruled the plantation with the ruthless efficiency of a general and the cold charm of a woman who had once known softness but had long buried it. At 32, she was a contradiction made flesh, beauty pressed into armor, poise sharpened into a weapon. Her late husband, Jonathan Montgomery, had been 29 years her senior, a man with power, money, and an appetite for control. Rumor whispered of his temper, of the nights when the grand house rattled with his rage, of the bruises Victoria hid beneath lace sleeves. No one ever said these things aloud. The Montgomery name was too powerful, too feared. But the way Victoria carried herself, elegance laced with caution, told its own story. When he died of yellow fever, the town mourned the man and pitied the young widow. But Victoria did not seem like a woman in need of pity. She stepped into her husband's role with uncanny aptitude, mastering accounts, managing crops, negotiating prices. Some said she was brilliant, others said she was ruthless. Everyone agreed she was untouchable, yet even in her untouchability, there was loneliness. Inside the 3-story Greek Revival mansion, white columns rising like spears, balconies shaded by climbing vines, silence reigned. Portraits of the Montgomery ancestors stared down at her, stern and judgmental. Servants moved quietly through the halls. Victoria often sat alone in the library, the one room in the house that smelled of cedar and ink instead of grief. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she simply stared into the fireplace, lips tightening as though holding back words she had no one to speak to. Under silk and wealth, she was a woman marked by something private: fear, longing, memory, or all three. When Victoria saw Joshua for the first time at the Natchez docks, something in her froze. Not because he was handsome, though he was. Not because he stood tall while others bowed, but because the defiance in his eyes mirrored a defiance she herself had once possessed. Before marriage, before widowhood, before life pressed its thumb against her throat and told her to behave. Buying him had been impulsive, reckless even. She had startled herself with how quickly she raised her voice at the auction, how firmly she kept her gaze on him even as murmurs rippled through the crowd. But once the decision was made, she clung to her composure. A Montgomery never wavered in public. Back at the plantation, she assigned Joshua not to the fields, but to the house, naming him her personal servant, a role that confused the household staff and enraged Overseer Whitlock, who believed strength belonged under the sun, not under a roof. Victoria ignored Whitlock's objections. She always had final word. But as days unfolded into weeks, something strange happened. The nearness of Joshua, his quiet presence, his refusal to cower, the way he listened without shrinking, began to trouble her. She found herself watching him when she shouldn't, listening for his footsteps in the hall, wondering what he thought when he looked out at the fields each morning. She despised this curiosity. It felt like weakness, and Victoria Montgomery did not permit herself weakness. Joshua, for his part, tried to avoid her eyes. Not out of fear. Fear was foreign to him, but because the look in her gaze unsettled him in ways he could not explain. He sensed something hidden beneath her composure, something bruised, something yearning, and he knew instinctively that a slave who noticed such things in his mistress walked a dangerously thin line. But fate had already begun stitching their lives together in threads neither could see. Before long, one accident, small, sudden, unavoidable, would pull them into the same breath, the same room, the same forbidden closeness, and nothing after that would ever be the same. The day it happened began like any other, hot, heavy, and humming with the relentless rhythm of labor. The sun had barely risen, yet sweat already beaded on the brows of those working the fields. Cicadas screamed from the treetops. The air felt thick enough to drink. Inside the mansion, morning routines unfolded with mechanical precision. Victoria moved through the halls with a ledger tucked under her arm, her heels tapping softly against polished floors. Servants stepped aside as she passed. She acknowledged none of them. Joshua followed at a respectful distance, carrying a stack of correspondence and the keyring entrusted to him. His strides were silent, his posture straight. He never walked ahead of her, never walked too close, but the space between them held an invisible electricity, unspoken, unwelcome, undeniable. The incident began with a single shout. "Ma'am, ma'am, look out!" Victoria had been descending the back veranda steps on her way to the carriage when the old railing, rotted through by termites, gave a sudden, violent crack. Her foot slipped on the slick wood. The ledger fell from her arms. For one terrifying heartbeat, she teetered backward, the long drop to the brick courtyard yawning open behind her. But before the world could tilt, Joshua moved. He reached her in 2 strides, fast, instinctive, unthinking. His hand caught her waist, the other gripping her forearm, steadying her with a strength that drew her flush against his chest. Her breath fled her lungs. The scent of him, clean sweat, earth, sun-warmed cotton, filled her senses. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. For the first time since her husband's death, someone was touching her, not with cruelty, not with expectation, but to save her. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" Joshua's voice was low, steady, the kind that could calm a runaway horse. She could not speak at first. Her hands, trembling despite her will, remained braced against him. His body was warm, solid, a wall of strength she had never allowed herself to lean on. When she finally found her voice, it came out breathless. I'm fine. Release me." But he didn't release her immediately. His grip loosened, yes, but his hands stayed where they were, one at her waist, one at her arm, because she was still unsteady, and he knew she would fall if he let go too soon. That hesitation, brief but unmistakable, did something dangerous inside her. When she finally stepped back, her heart was thundering. Joshua lowered his gaze respectfully, but she saw the flicker of something in his eyes, a concern that was not permitted, a softness that should not exist. She turned away too quickly. "Thank you," she said. the words stiff and foreign on her tongue. "Always, ma'am," he replied. But the moment was not over. Unbeknownst to them, Overseer Whitlock had been watching from the barn. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled around the handle of his whip. To him, the sight was an abomination, a slave daring to lay hands on the mistress and the mistress accepting it. He said nothing then, but the seed was planted. Suspicion took root. Meanwhile, Victoria tried to restore her composure, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She retrieved her fallen ledger, but as she did, her fingers brushed the place where Joshua had steadied her. Heat lingered there. Memory, too. For the rest of the day, she found her thoughts wandering back to the moment he held her, the steadiness of his arms, the gentleness in a world without gentleness. She loathed herself for it. Joshua, too, felt the echo of that touch long after. Saving her had been instinct, but the memory of her fear, the softness of her breath near his jaw. It unsettled him more than any threat of punishment. Neither of them spoke of it. But something had shifted, irrevocably. Boundaries that had kept them safe had blurred, and the world around them, rigid, watchful, unforgiving, had begun to notice. In the days after Joshua caught her on the veranda steps, Victoria tried to pretend nothing had changed. She tried by tightening her routines, by speaking more briskly than necessary, by assigning him tasks that kept him in motion and her at a distance, polishing silver, cataloguing the wine cellar, checking the shutters before storms. If she could turn him into a function, a useful extension of her will, perhaps she could silence the unwelcome awareness that had begun humming under her skin whenever he entered a room. It did not work. The problem with making a man your personal servant is that he is always there. He lit the lamps in the evening, his shadow gliding along the walls just behind hers. He poured her coffee in the morning, his fingers steady even when the china rattled faintly in its saucer. He stood near the door during meetings with factors and lawyers, silent as carved wood but more present, somehow, than the men who talked. She began to notice things she had never allowed herself to notice in any man, much less a slave. The way his hands moved, precise, careful, as if he understood that in a world built to break him, the surety of his own movements was a kind of quiet rebellion. The way he listened when others spoke, not with the blank stare of someone waiting for orders, but with a mind that was awake, measuring words, weighing motives. More than once, she caught him glancing through the open French doors toward the fields, eyes narrowing slightly when Whitlock's whip cracked. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He never said anything. It was the restraint that unnerved her most. She had known men who could not restrain themselves. Men who let temper and desire explode outward without thought. Joshua was not like them. His silence was chosen, not forced, and somewhere in that knowledge lay the first flicker of something that felt dangerously like respect. One evening, a storm rolled in from the river with little warning. The sky went from blue to bruised purple in minutes. Rain began to lash against the tall windows of the house, drumming on the roof, turning the packed earth out front into a slick red mire. Thunder walked across the sky, low and insistent. Victoria was in the library when the storm hit, a ledger open but unread in front of her. Lightning strobed through the tall windows, illuminating rows of leather-bound volumes, the dark gleam of mahogany shelves, the polished brass of the oil lamps. Books had been her truest refuge since childhood. Even her marriage could not quite steal them from her. Thunder cracked so close that the glass trembled. Somewhere in the house, a child cried, one of the enslaved women's babies, spooked awake. A door slammed, voices rose, the storm crawled into everyone's bones. A knock sounded at the library door. "Yes," she called, expecting a maid. The door opened, and Joshua stepped inside, the lamplight catching the water still beading along his sleeves. He'd clearly just come from checking shutters and doors. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said quietly. "The wind's gone bad out by the east wing. I came to make sure the windows in here are latched tight." She should have dismissed him with a nod. She knew that. Instead, she found herself saying, "Very well, see to it." He moved along the wall of windows, checking each latch with hands that were sure even as the panes rattled. The storm framed him, white flashes of lightning throwing his profile into sharp relief, the cords of his forearms visible beneath his rolled sleeves. She watched him more openly than she ever had, because the storm felt like a curtain, a shield between them and the rest of the world. "Does thunder frighten you, ma'am?" he asked suddenly, still looking at the window. The question startled her. Slaves did not ask mistresses about fear. "It does not," she said, a little too sharply. He did not apologize. "It used to frighten my mother," he said instead. "On nights like this, she'd sing over the sound. Said if the Lord was making that much noise, he'd need something soft to remind him we were here, too." His voice altered as he spoke of her, softened, grew warmer. Victoria's fingers tightened on the edge of her ledger. "What did she sing?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He glanced back at her, surprise flickering over his features, then smoothed away. Spirituals mostly. Songs about crossing over rivers, climbing mountains, seeing the promised land. Things that sounded impossible when your back was raw and your feet were bleeding. "And did you believe her?" Victoria asked, though part of her wanted to stop this, to shut the door on the intimacy creeping in through his memories. He hesitated. "I wanted to," he said. "She said no chain forged by man could bind a soul. But they chained her away from me when I was 10, sold her south. Hard to believe in crossing rivers when you never see the other shore." The room seemed to contract around his words. The storm pounded on the glass. Another crack of lightning lit his face. There was no self-pity in him, only a simple recitation of fact. That made it worse. Victoria swallowed. Her own wedding night flashed across her mind, the smell of her husband's cigar smoke, the weight of his hand at her throat when she tried to pull away, his voice telling her that a wife's body was not hers to control. She had never spoken of it to anyone. Not once. "You may go," she said abruptly, retreating into the only armor she knew. Command. "The windows are secure." He inclined his head. "Yes, ma'am." But he did not reach the door. "Wait," she heard herself say. He stopped, turned. Thunder rolled again as if the sky itself were listening. "Can you read, Joshua?" she asked. His face changed in that instant. Just a flicker, but she saw it. Caution, wariness, something like a tiny flare of hope swiftly smothered. "A little," he admitted. "Letters. Some words. I ain't had schooling proper, but I learned what I could when no one was looking." "From whom?" Her voice had softened without her intending it. "From a preacher once," he said. "Before they sold me off that place. He thought every man should know how to read scripture, no matter the color of his skin. Overseer found out, flogged him near to death. Said the Bible was a book for masters, not for property." His jaw set. "They burned the little primer he gave me, but I'd already seen enough letters to keep them in my head." She stared at him. In another world, in another life, he might have been a scholar, a teacher, a man who stood in front of a classroom instead of behind someone else's chair. The injustice of it pressed against her ribs like a physical weight. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, she stood, crossed to one of the shelves and pulled down a slim volume of poetry. "Come here," she said. He did not move at first. "Ma'am, if Whitlock finds me in here—" "Whitlock does not enter this room without my invitation," she cut in. "Now come." He obeyed, crossing the carpeted floor with a carefulness that might have been mistaken for deference. She suspected it was something else, an awareness of the line they were both walking. She laid the book open on the desk between them. The candlelight pooled in the crease of the pages, turning the ink almost bronze. "Read," she said quietly. "As much as you can." His hands rested on the edge of the desk, close enough to her own that she could feel the heat rising from his skin. He bent his head, eyes narrowing slightly as he focused on the words. The tides of fate, he began haltingly, then gathered speed. No. Man may say what? Storms shall break upon his shore. His accent wrapped itself around each syllable, thick but careful. He stumbled on unforeseen and tempest, corrected himself on morrow, paused on sovereign. But he made his way through the stanza with a determination that made her throat tighten. When he finished, he straightened, keeping his gaze on the page as if afraid of what he might see in her eyes. That was good, she said softly. You recognize more words than most children of planters I've known. A faint, incredulous smile ghosted over his lips, there and gone. I ain't had anyone say that to me before, ma'am. You have now, she replied. Silence settled between them, but it was no longer empty. It carried the weight of what had passed. Shared memory, shared secret, shared acknowledgement of a mind the world insisted should not exist. She should have ended it there. She knew the danger. Teaching a slave to read was not just frowned upon. In many counties, it was a crime. A mistress seen alone in a library with a young male slave, heads bent over the same book. If rumors began, they would not stop at education. Yet something in her, something that had been starved for years, lifted its head. If you wish, she said, forcing her voice to remain even, you may come to the library after the household retires. To read, as long as you are discreet. His eyes flicked up then, meeting hers fully. In their depths, she saw wonder, suspicion, fear, hunger. Why? He asked quietly. Because I cannot endure one more day in a house where every soul around me is kept deliberately ignorant. Because I am tired of speaking only with men who see me as property with lace instead of chains. Because when you read those words just now, you sounded more alive than anyone I've heard in months. She could say none of that. Because an educated servant is more useful, she said coolly instead. And because it amuses me. On his face, something flickered, hurt maybe. But then he nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'll be discreet. That night, long after the last candle in the great house had been extinguished, a single light burned in the library. The floorboards in the hallway creaked as Joshua moved, barefoot, along the familiar route. His heart beat hard enough to make him light-headed. He had stolen through darkness before, but always for food, for tools, for the smallest scraps of autonomy. Never for this. At the library door he paused, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the distant hoot of an owl beyond the windows. He tapped lightly. Enter, came her whisper. The room glowed with lamplight, shadows flickering over the spines of the books. Victoria sat at the desk, not in one of her formal gowns, but in a simple, dark dressing gown, her hair braided loosely down her back. Without the rigid bodice and high collar, she looked younger, less like an icon, and more like a woman whose shoulders had carried too much for too long. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then she gestured to the chair opposite. Sit, he did, moving carefully, aware of every inch that closed between them. She opened a different book this time, one with larger print, fewer flourishes. A reader, the sort used to teach children. We'll start here, she said. I won't have you stumbling through Corinthians before you've mastered basic structure. He almost smiled in spite of himself. Yes, ma'am. Hours passed in a quiet rhythm, her finger underlining lines, his voice sounding out words. Sometimes she corrected him, sometimes she let him correct himself. Now and then, when he encountered a phrase that puzzled him, he asked, "What's that mean?" And she found herself explaining metaphors and idioms to a man who understood hardship more intimately than any poet. The candle burned lower. The storm outside softened to a patter of rain. The world shrank to ink and breath and the subtle scrape of pages turning. At one point, he misread liberty as liability. She corrected him, then hesitated. "Do you know what liberty is?" she asked. He looked at the word, then at her. "I know what it ain't," he said. "Ain't this?" He gestured vaguely. To the room, the house, the world outside the windows. "But I don't know what it feels like." "Not really." Her chest twisted. "Liberty," she said slowly, choosing her words as if they were glass, "is waking up in the morning and knowing that no one can tell you what to do with your own life, your own body. That you can go or stay or speak or keep silent, and no one has the right to strike you for it." He studied her. "You know that feeling, ma'am?" The question cut her deeper than he could have guessed. "I thought I would," she said softly. "When my husband died and left me this place, everyone said I was fortunate. A widow with wealth and land, what freedom! But I found my cage had simply changed shape." She met his gaze. "Some prisons have bars. Some have silk curtains." For the first time, she saw anger in his eyes. Anger not at her, but for her. "They make you live alone in this big house, calling it respectability," he said quietly. "They whisper if you speak too much, judge if you smile too wide, decide for you who you ought to be. That don't sound like freedom to me." She swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. No one had ever named it that way. Not her family, not her late husband, not the women who visited for tea and spoke of her good fortune. "I am not a slave," she said, almost defensively. "No," he agreed, "but they still own pieces of you, don't they?" The words hung between them, raw and dangerous. She should have rebuked him, reminded him of his place. Instead, to her own astonishment, she nodded. "I suppose they do," she murmured. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Joshua reached out, not toward her, but toward the book. "What's the next word?" he asked. She exhaled, grateful for the shift, and they returned to the page. But the air between them was altered now, charged with the knowledge they had just shared, that freedom and bondage were not as cleanly divided by color and class as the world liked to pretend. As the nights went on, their secret lessons became a ritual. He would arrive with the quiet of a shadow. She would have a book ready. Scripture sometimes history. Once, a novel. She told herself it was to test his comprehension, but the truth was she wanted to see his face when he encountered characters who chose their own destinies. They talked more, too, in the spaces between words. He told her about the plantation where he was born, the way his mother's hands smelled of soap and smoke, the day they came for her, and how the sound of her crying as they dragged her away had carved something out of his chest that never grew back. She told him about being 16 and married off to Jonathan Montgomery, about sitting on the edge of a wedding bed too large and too cold, about learning to smile and lie and shrink herself small enough to fit inside the role assigned to her. Some nights they disagreed, about God, about justice, about whether patience was a virtue or a trap. Their voices would rise above a whisper, then drop back down when floorboards creaked somewhere overhead. Each small clash drew them closer, sharpening the sense that no one else in their world could challenge them this way. The first time their hands touched by choice, it was almost accidental. He had finished reading a passage about a ship in a storm and sat back, brow furrowed. "I like that," he said, "the way they talk about the waves like they got a mind of their own." "The sea is a law unto itself," she replied. "Men can build ships and write charts, but water obeys neither." He nodded slowly, then reached for the book to close it. His fingers brushed the back of her hand. The contact was brief, barely more than a whisper of skin on skin, but it was intentional. Neither of them jerked away, neither pretended it had not happened. For the space of a heartbeat, their hands rested against each other, his rough palm against her softer knuckles. Heat rushed up her arm. The lamplight threw gold over the planes of his face, the curve of his mouth, the strong line of his throat. She heard her pulse in her ears. Then she drew her hand back, fingers curling. "This is foolishness," she said. But the words lacked conviction. "Learning to read ain't foolish," he replied, misinterpreting, or choosing to misinterpret, the meaning she had loaded into that single word. "I'm not speaking of reading," she snapped, then immediately regretted the sharpness. His gaze flicked away, jaw tightening. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I am tired." He nodded once. "I should go, ma'am. It's late." He stood, pushing back his chair, and for one wild moment she wanted to grab his sleeve, to say stay, to ask him to tell her one more story about his mother's songs, so the storm in her own chest would quiet. She said nothing. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth," he said, not turning around. "I don't think you foolish." "Then you are the only one," she answered. "I doubt that," he murmured, and slipped into the dark. After he left, she sat alone with the extinguished candle, palms pressed flat against the cool wood of the desk, struggling to steady her breathing. She began going to church more regularly after that. On Sundays, she sat in the front pew reserved for planters' families, her spine straight, bonnet tied tight beneath her chin, listening as the pastor thundered about order, about obedience, about the natural hierarchy of God's creation. He preached that the Negro was born to serve, that slavery was a burden placed on Christian masters to civilize an inferior race. He quoted scripture about wives submitting to husbands, children honoring fathers, slaves obeying masters. Victoria listened, lips pressed thin. Beside her, ladies fanned themselves. Behind her, she could feel the presence of the enslaved in the gallery, their bodies packed together, their songs banned in favor of the hymns chosen for them. At one sermon, the pastor warned specifically against unnatural affections, against any sentiment that might cross the sacred lines of race and station. His words painted vivid images of corruption, of God's wrath, of communities torn apart. She sat very still, fingers digging into her gloves until the seams creaked. That night, when Joshua came to the library, she nearly sent him away. Nearly. But when she opened her mouth, the word "no" tangled itself around her tongue and never reached her lips. Instead, she pushed a Bible toward him. "If you are to read," she said, "you should read this, for your soul's sake." He looked at her for a long moment, something like amusement and sorrow mingling in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They read from Exodus, about a people in bondage in a land that was not theirs, about a God who heard their cries. Joshua's voice trembled slightly on certain lines. When he reached the part about Pharaoh's heart hardening, he stopped. "Maybe the Lord keeps some hearts hard," he murmured, half to himself, "so he can show what he can do when he finally breaks them." She did not ask whose heart he meant. Her own felt like an organ caught between hammer and anvil. "What do you pray for, Joshua?" she asked quietly. He considered. "Not freedom, not anymore," he said at last. "Seems a man could waste his whole life praying for what this world ain't never going to give him. I pray instead that when I stand before God, he'll see me as a man, not as the world labeled me." His answer undid her. She realized, with a clarity that stole her breath, that she had spent years praying for smaller things. Good crops, cooperative markets, protection from scandal. She had never once prayed to be seen. After that night, her prayers changed. She asked, in words barely more than a whisper, "Lord, show me what is right, not what is safe." She asked for the strength to face herself. She did not dare ask for the right to love. The bond between them deepened in ways that had nothing to do with touch and everything to do with recognition. She began to anticipate his thoughts, finishing his sentences when he searched for a word. He began to read her silences, handing her a glass of water when her voice roughened from arguing with factors. stepping closer when Whitlock lingered too long in a doorway with that oily, assessing look. Some evenings, they didn't read at all. They just talked. They spoke of the river, of how he had once watched a boat heading north until it disappeared at the bend, wondering what it would feel like to be on it. She confessed that she had never left Mississippi except for a brief, chaperoned trip to New Orleans before her marriage. The world beyond felt as distant to her as freedom did to him. "You know the funny thing," he said one night, leaning back in his chair, hands folded over his chest. "You standing on that veranda with all this land spread out in front of you, and me in the field looking back at the house. Both of us staring at something we can't get to." It was the first time he'd allowed himself to voice the equality of their longing so plainly. She could have reprimanded him. Instead, she smiled, a small, sad curve of the lips. "Perhaps we are more alike than either of us should admit," she said. His eyes held hers across the small expanse of the desk. The lamplight painted shadows along his cheekbones, across the bridge of his nose, turning his irises almost black. "Alike," he echoed softly. Imagine what the world would say to that. The world, if it had seen them in that moment, would not just have spoken. It would have screamed. One late night, as autumn deepened and the air grew cool enough that their breath fogged near the unlit windows, the closeness between them finally crept to the edge of something neither of them could name without shattering everything. They were reading a passage from a novel. Two characters walking in a garden, confessing feelings that had grown slowly against sense and expectation. Joshua read the words aloud, his voice dropping on the line. "I've tried to root you out of my heart, but you have grown there like a stubborn vine." He stopped, swallowed. The silence that followed felt as if it had edges. Victoria's pulse pounded. The words hung between them, no longer just ink on paper. "Do you think that possible?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "For one person to become so rooted in another?" He did not answer at once. His gaze lifted from the page, finding hers. "I think," he said slowly, carefully, "that when two souls recognize each other, there ain't much the world can do to stop what grows between them. It can punish it, beat it, outlaw it. But stop it." He shook his head. "I'm not so sure." Her throat worked. "Even if the law says it is an abomination." "The law once said I was 3/5 of a man," he replied, voice steady. "Forgive me if I don't treat it as scripture." Her hand trembled on the desk. She realized, with a flash of terror and exhilaration, that they were no longer speaking in abstractions. Every word was a step closer to a cliff. The faintest of sounds broke the spell, a board creaking in the hallway outside. They both froze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, approaching the door. Victoria's heart leapt into her throat. She snatched the book closed, shoving it aside. Joshua rose in one fluid motion, stepping back into the shadows near the tall shelves. The handle turned, then stopped. A moment later, the footsteps receded. They remained motionless, listening until the house fell quiet again. When Joshua stepped back into the lamplight, his face was pale under his dark skin, sweat beading at his temples. "It's not just scripture or law we're playing with," he said hoarsely. "It's a noose." She knew he was right, yet when their eyes met once more, with danger still echoing in the hall outside, neither of them could deny what had already taken root. They were beyond curiosity now, beyond sympathy, beyond respect. Their bond was no longer merely forbidden. It was inevitable. For weeks, the world around them continued its relentless churn. Cotton weighed, accounts tallied, wagons loaded, overseers shouting across the fields. To an outsider, Montgomery Plantation looked unchanged. But within the mansion's walls, the air had grown different. Thicker, more watchful. Whitlock felt it first. He couldn't have articulated what he sensed, only that something in the great house no longer aligned with the natural order he believed himself born to uphold. Joshua, once a silent tool in the household machinery, now carried himself with a steadiness Whitlock found insubordinate. Victoria's gaze lingered on her servant too long, her voice dropped too soft when addressing him, her posture tensed when Whitlock approached. A man like Whitlock, armed with suspicion and cruelty in equal measure, did not need proof to smell danger. One afternoon, as Joshua crossed the courtyard carrying a bucket of ash for the forge, Whitlock blocked his path. "You've been getting mighty comfortable in that big house," he drawled, leaning forward in the saddle. "Ain't healthy for a field buck to forget where he come from." Joshua kept walking. Whitlock yanked his horse sideways, cutting him off again. "Look at me when I'm speaking." Joshua slowly lifted his gaze, but not the way Whitlock wanted. Not bowed, not afraid. Calm, direct. A man's gaze, not a slave's. Whitlock's jaw tightened. "You think because the mistress keeps you under her roof, you're something special?" Joshua said nothing. Whitlock leaned close, breath hot with whiskey. "I seen her call for you more'n she used to. Seen you linger in rooms too long. You forget your place, boy. You'll find yourself in the ground faster than you can blink." Joshua finally spoke. "I know my place," Whitlock snared. "Do you? 'Cause I'm starting to think the mistress forgot hers." With that, he spurred his horse, mud splashing across Joshua's legs as Whitlock galloped away toward the fields. Joshua stood in the courtyard long after he'd gone, the weight of the threat pressing cold against his spine. Whitlock was not a man who issued idle warnings, and if Whitlock was watching, others might be too. That evening, as he lit the lamps in the hall, Joshua paused before knocking on the library door. His knuckles hovered above the wood, but he couldn't bring himself to tap. The memory of Whitlock's eyes, sharp, hungry, echoed through him. Victoria opened the door before he could retreat. "Is something wrong?" she asked, studying him. He hesitated. "Whitlock's getting suspicious." A flicker of worry crossed her features. She stepped back, ushering him inside, and shut the door quietly behind them. "What did he say?" she asked, voice low. Joshua recounted the exchange. With each word, her posture stiffened, breath growing shallower. By the time he finished, her hands had curled into fists at her sides. "He thinks something improper is happening," she whispered. Joshua looked at her. "Something improper is happening." She met his eyes, fear and longing warring across her face. Not what he's implying," she said quickly, though the words rang hollow. "We've done nothing they'd accept," he murmured. "Nothing they wouldn't hang me for." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. She paced the room, skirts brushing the floor, hands trembling at her sides. "I can dismiss him," she said abruptly. "Send him off the property. Claim incompetence. That might buy us." "No." Joshua's voice was firm. "Dismissing him will only prove him right, and it'll make enemies talk louder." "Then what do you suggest?" she demanded, turning on him, panic sharpening her tone. "We cannot keep meeting like this. We cannot continue this deception forever." He stepped toward her. "Then say the word," he said. "End it. Tell me to stay out of this room. Tell me I ain't to speak to you except in public. Tell me to forget you." Her breath hitched. For a moment, the world held still. "I can't," she whispered. He closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. "Then we'll be careful." "Careful won't be enough," she said, voice breaking. "Whitlock isn't merely suspicious. He hates you, and he hates me for keeping you near. If he believes he can destroy us both at once." A sound cut her off. Footsteps, slow, steady, approaching the library. The same feeling as before. Cold panic like a hand closing around her throat washed through her. Joshua stepped back into the shadows. Victoria forced her face into composure and opened the door just as Whitlock reached it. "Ma'am," he said, pulling off his hat with oily politeness. "Forgive the disturbance. I was hoping for a word." She blocked the doorway, ensuring he could not see inside. "Make it brief." Whitlock smiled, a thin serpent smile. "Some rumors been stirring, Mrs. Montgomery. Other planters asking questions. Folks curious about why your new buck spends so much time in the house." He lowered his voice. "Curious about both of you." Her fingers clenched around the doorframe. "You will mind your tongue." "Oh, I intend to," Whitlock said softly. "But tongues only stay still when their owners get what they want." Her stomach plummeted. "What is it you think you want?" He leaned in, breath foul, voice low. "Raise my wages, give me control of the West Fields, and maybe I find myself too busy to notice improprieties." Victoria's blood ran cold. Extortion. Whitlock straightened his hat. "I'll expect your answer soon." He walked away, boots echoing down the hall, leaving the stench of threat behind him. Victoria shut the door with shaking hands. Joshua emerged from the shadows. "He won't stop," he said quietly. "No," she whispered. "He won't." She met Joshua's eyes. And in that moment, terrifying, electric, they both understood. Their world was no longer merely watching, it was closing in. Whitlock did not wait long for his answer. By the next evening, the overseer had already begun spreading whispers across the quarters and among nearby plantations. Nothing direct, just enough smoke to make men curious, to make women gasp behind gloved hands, to make a visiting factor raise an eyebrow when Joshua entered the room. Victoria felt the walls tightening. At dinner, the staff moved with brittle efficiency. Lamps flickered in strange drafts. A window latch mysteriously loosened, despite having been secured. Twice, Victoria thought she saw shadows moving where no one should be. The plantation was holding its breath. That night, she paced her bedroom, fingers trembling as she ran them over the mantel, the drapes, the cold silver brush on her vanity. The storm outside was building again, thunder rumbling low, wind stirring the trees into restless shapes. Then she heard it, a pounding on the servants' door downstairs. Raised voices. Whitlock's fury cutting through the night. "You think I'm blind? The whole damn county knows what's been going on in this house." Her blood froze. Before she could move, another voice, the sheriff's, boomed through the hall. "Open this door, Mrs. Montgomery. We have cause to search the premises." Victoria's heart slammed into her ribs. She darted from her room, skirts gathered in shaking hands, slipping into the dark hallway that led toward the library. Joshua. He would be there, waiting. At the same moment, Whitlock and the sheriff were storming through the front. She flew down the stairs, bare feet silent against the carpet, breath tight in her throat. "Joshua," she whispered urgently as she reached the library door. "We have to move, now." He stepped out of the shadows, already alert, already understanding. "They're here for me." "No," she insisted, clutching his arm. "They are here for us." He took her hand, brief, forbidden, grounding. "Then we run." The decision came quicker than breath. She grabbed the iron key from the desk drawer, the key to the cellar door behind the kitchen. It led to the storage tunnels beneath the original foundation, a forgotten network that once housed storm supplies, old furniture, and secrets of the first Montgomerys. Victoria led the way, Joshua close behind. They moved through the dark hall like twin shadows, hearts pounding in the same rhythm. Behind them, doors slammed open. Boots thundered across the floorboards. "Search every damn room," Whitlock barked. "Find that buck." Victoria and Joshua reached the hidden door behind the pantry and slipped inside just as lantern light flickered past. They descended into the cellar, cool, damp, smelling of earth and old wood. Thunder cracked overhead. "Keep low," Joshua whispered, guiding her deeper into the narrow passage carved between limestone blocks. The ceiling was low enough that he had to bow his head. Above them, the search moved room to room. The sheriff's voice grew louder. "She's hiding him." No decent white woman would check the library. Victoria winced. If they found the open books, if they found the second chair pulled close. Joshua caught her hand again, squeezing gently. Look at me. She did. We survived this, he said, steady as a vow. Together. Before she could answer, a deafening crash erupted above. Wood splintered, bookshelves overturned. Whitlock shouted triumphantly, "There's footprints in the dust. They've been meetin' in here. Get the sheriff." Joshua pulled Victoria farther into the tunnel, but the passage narrowed ahead, a collapsed section blocking the path. "No," she whispered, voice cracking. "We can't go through." He braced a shoulder against the fallen beam, pushing, but it wouldn't budge. Years of rot and weight had fused the debris into a solid barrier. Behind them, footsteps entered the cellar stairwell. Lanterns glowed against the stone walls. Shadows spilled down the steps. The voices were close. Too close. "They must be down here. Fan out. Bring a rope." Joshua turned, positioning himself between her and the approaching search party. He picked up an old iron bar lying against the wall, heavy, rusted, but dangerous in his hands. Victoria grabbed his arm. "No, you raise that and they'll shoot you on sight." "They'll hang me anyway," he said quietly. "I'd rather take one with me." "No," she whispered fiercely. "You promised me. You promised you would come back to me. You do not break that promise tonight." The footsteps grew louder. Joshua exhaled once, chest heaving. "Then there's only one chance." He grabbed her shoulders, eyes burning. "When they come down here, you scream," he said. "Tell them I forced you. Tell them I dragged you down to hurt you. They'll believe it. They want to believe it. You'll be safe." She recoiled, horrified. "I will not damn you with my own mouth." "It's the only way you live," he insisted, voice breaking. "If they think you protected me, they'll kill you too." Boots hit the bottom step. Lantern light washed over the far end of the tunnel. "Ma'am, please," Joshua begged. "If I gotta die, let me die knowing you live." Tears blurred her vision. She grabbed his face in both hands. "Do not say that. Do not surrender yourself. Not for me." Whitlock's voice thundered down the passage. There they are." Joshua shoved Victoria behind him, every muscle taut. Sheriff Rutledge raised his pistol. "Step away from the woman, boy." Whitlock's grin gleamed cruelly in the lantern light. "I knew it. I knew you were rutting with her like an animal." Victoria's scream split the air. "Stop! Stop!" The sheriff cocked the hammer. "Hands where I can see 'em." Joshua slowly lifted his hands, iron bar clattering to the floor. Whitlock stepped forward, rope already in hand. "Didn't think you'd catch 'em together, did you, Sheriff?" Now we got both sin and evidence. Victoria broke free of Joshua's grasp and threw herself between him and the sheriff's gun. "You will not touch him," she shouted, voice raw. The cellar went silent. The sheriff stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Whitlock's face twisted with triumph. "You admit it," Whitlock said softly. "In front of the law, in front of God, you admit you've been laying with him." Victoria's breath shook. She looked at Joshua, for strength, for truth, for anything, and he looked back with a plea she felt like a physical pull in her chest. Slowly, deliberately, she said, "Yes." Whitlock lunged forward, grabbing Joshua by the arm. "Get the rope!" Joshua cried out as the sheriff and the overseer wrestled him toward the steps. Victoria fought like a wild thing, clawing at Whitlock, screaming his name, but two deputies held her back. Her voice echoed through the stone chamber. "No, no, don't take him. Don't touch him." But the rope awaited. The noose awaited. Outside, thunder answered her cries. And with every step Joshua was dragged upward, lightning lit the path to the scaffold that would become his grave. Lightning split the sky above Natchez as Joshua was dragged toward the scaffold, rain turning the packed dirt beneath him into red-brown mud. The sheriff barked orders. Deputies hauled torches closer, and Whitlock, dripping with triumph, tightened the rope with hands that shook from eagerness rather than fear. "Get that noose ready," someone shouted. "Hang him now. Make an example of him," another cried. Joshua stumbled, his wrists bound, his breath ragged. But he did not beg, did not plead. His eyes searched the frantic crowd, and in the chaos, he saw her, Victoria, barefoot, hair undone, running toward the scaffold through the downpour, her nightgown plastered to her skin. The deputies tried to hold her back, but she tore free with a strength born from terror. "Stop this!" she screamed. "You have no right." Whitlock turned, sneering. "He ain't a man, ma'am. He's property. He broke the law, and you shamed your own blood by loving him." Victoria climbed the first step of the scaffold, chest heaving, eyes blazing like fire under the rain. "Then let the shame be mine alone," she said. "But you will not kill him." The sheriff stepped forward. "Mrs. Montgomery, step aside. You confessed. We all heard you." Lightning crashed. The crowd murmured in confusion and anger, but Victoria did not move. With trembling hands, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a packet wrapped in oilskin. Documents she had hidden for years. Letters, ledgers, names, every misdeed Jonathan Montgomery had recorded before his death, and Whitlock's among them. "You want truth?" she shouted, holding the packet high. "Here it is, evidence of illegal imports, bribes, beatings that resulted in death. Whitlock's crimes, your crimes, Sheriff." Gasps tore through the crowd. The sheriff paled. Whitlock lunged toward her, but Joshua slammed his shoulder into him, sending the overseer sprawling into the mud. Chaos erupted. "Arrest them both," the sheriff yelled. "No," shouted several in the crowd, men who had lost kin to Whitlock's cruelty, women who feared God's wrath more than social scandal. Torches wavered. The crowd turned restless, divided. Lightning struck a tree nearby, sending splinters flying. Horses reared, deputies scattered. Victoria seized the moment. She cut Joshua's bindings with a knife hidden in her sleeve and grabbed his hand. "Run," she whispered. "Run with me." And together, under the roar of thunder, under the cries of a world that wanted them dead, they fled into the storm. Behind them, Whitlock rose from the mud, screaming curses drowned beneath the rain. The sheriff hesitated, torn between law and survival, and before he could act, the crowd surged, blocking the path. Victoria and Joshua vanished into the night. Years later, in a quiet northern town, a woman with silvering hair and a man with eyes still fierce despite time sat on a sun-warmed porch. 3 children played beneath the apple tree. Freedom was not easy, not guaranteed, but it was theirs, earned through fire, through terror, through impossible love. Sometimes, in the evenings, Victoria would take Joshua's hand, their fingers fitting together with the ease of 2 people who had survived the unthinkable. "We lived," she would whisper. "We survived," he would answer. "We loved," she'd say. And that, he'd reply, was worth everything. Narrator: the story is over, but the pain of that era still resonates. How are you feeling right now? Are you listening to the story alone or with someone? Share your feelings and where you are right now.